Hello, I'm David Dillard-Wright. Welcome to this Introduction to Philosophy class. Um, for this first unit on Greek philosophy, we're going to be using this Reginald Allen text. It's called Greek Philosophy Thales to Aristotle. So you're going to be needing this a little bit later. I'm going to start out though with this blank slide, which just says, what is philosophy? And if you would, just get out a blank sheet of paper and write down a few words about what you think philosophy is. It could be anything. There's really no wrong answers here. So go ahead and pause the recording and write down your own response. Now moving on, take a look at what you wrote down. Maybe you wrote something down about ethics. What does it mean to live a good life? Or maybe you wrote some profound question like, what is the meaning of life? Or maybe you wrote down the name of some philosophers that you've heard of, maybe Plato or Aristotle. I have a quote here that I think will get at the point behind doing that exercise. This is from one of my favorite philosophers, the 20th century phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty. And this is what he says: one does not enter the pantheon of philosophers by having worked assiduously at having only eternal thoughts. And the ring of truth never resounds so long as it does when the author calls upon his life for it. Past philosophies do not survive in their spirit alone as stages of a final system. Their access to the timeless is not a museum entrance. They endure with their truths and follies as total undertakings, or they do not endure at all. There is not a philosophy which contains all philosophies. Philosophy as a whole is at certain moments in each philosophy. To take up the celebrated phrase again, philosophy's center is everywhere, and its circumference nowhere. So I think that what Merleau-Ponty is trying to get us to see there is that philosophy is an active and living pursuit. It's not something that we just lock away in the past, but it's something that is ongoing. Even when we go back and read ancient philosophy like we're going to be doing, we're still going to have a fresh take on those ancient texts. They're still going to mean something new to us today. And I think it's really cool that we can read something that might be 2,500 years old and still get something out of it and still have something interesting to say about it. And that it can still teach us something. So when you're writing down those questions or your ideas of philosophy on your scrap sheet of paper, to think about the meaning of philosophy or what philosophy is already to practice philosophy. So whether you're asking about the meaning of life or whether you're asking how the mind works, or you're asking about how to make good choices in life, you're already doing philosophy. So you're already at the center of philosophy, as it were. I just have one more quote for you. This is from Karl Jasper's The Existentialist Philosophy. This is from Way to Wisdom, which is a book that's a transcription of some radio talks that he gave. This is what he says: can we speak of development and progress in philosophy? We can observe certain lines of development, for example, from Socrates to Plato and Aristotle, from Kant to Hegel, from Locke to Hume. But even such sequences are false if we take them to mean that the later thinker preserved and transcended the truth of his predecessor. Even where generations are thus visibly linked, the new is not encompassed in what went before. The successor often relinquishes the essence of the earlier thought. Sometimes he no longer even understands it. So what I want to do here is give two different views of competing views of history. One view of history is what we might call technological positivism, which just says that people are simply better off today than they were 100 years ago or 200 years ago. So we might say, well, look, in 1900 people had a horse and carriage. They didn't have, the internet and all these cool technologies that we have today. So we're simply better off than they were. And the temptation might be to also transfer that over into the realm of thought or culture and to say, well, we must be better off in that area as well. But I think that would be a profound mistake. because in many ways the ancients were far more advanced than we are today. We don't think so much about living an ethical life, about leading a life of excellence, right? Which were the ancient thinkers were very good at. So in some areas we've made a lot of progress, but in other areas we haven't really. It's a big mistake to think that simply because we come later that we're superior to those who came before. And of course, in many ways, they prepared the foundations for everything that we're doing today. The opposite view of history is Romanticism, which is kind of the opposite narrative, which says that things were better in the past. People were more connected to each other. They were more connected to nature. They had a sort of mystical view of life, which we've lost today. And that narrative is a narrative of decline, a narrative of loss, a narrative of a fall from a more pure state. And I think this narrative has some truth to it, but it also is a distortion. In fact, you could say we're more ethical now today, right? Because treatment of women has gotten better. Certainly, we still have problems with racism, but things have improved in some ways than 100 years ago, right? So we have more gender equality, more equality in terms of sexual orientation and so forth. So I think it would be a mistake to look at history either as linear progress or as some sort of decline. And I think we should look at history more as a peaks and valleys view of history, or more what we might call just a more realistic view of history. So I think what Jaspers is trying to say is that a philosopher who comes later is not necessarily superior to one who came before, and may not even fully understand the philosophy that came before. And the same is true of us today. We may make some improvements here and there, but we should keep in mind that we may not fully understand what we're doing, and we can make mistakes, but even those mistakes can be very instructive. This is a pretty cool device. It's called the ANTIKYTHERA device, or ANTIKYTHERA mechanism. What you're looking at is a primitive. The word primitive is not a good word, but a mechanism, a computer, a clock, whatever you want to call it. The cool thing about this device is that it could calculate eclipses, the phases of the sun and moon, and the dates of the Olympic Games. And it had about 30 interlocking gears. I think this was discovered in the 20th century, but it wasn't until 2005 that its real purpose was discovered. You can see there the artist's rendering of what it looked like. The awesome thing about this device is that it was built in 146 BC. It would take 1,000 years for similar devices like this to appear. So, of course, the Greeks were always involved in warfare with one another, between city-states. Whatever city-state produced this device was most likely destroyed. Whoever the inventor of this device was, for whatever reason, did not pass down the knowledge of how to make this device, and it was simply lost. And the same thing happens today. Think about the Apollo mission that sent astronauts to the moon. Think about how they did a lot of those calculations with slide rules, right? They didn't, and they did have computers, but nothing like the computers that we have today. And yet, take a look at the amazing things that they were able to do with the technology that they had. So, knowledge can be gained, but knowledge can also be lost. Aristotle was also lost in the West for many centuries. Thank goodness Aristotle was passed into the Middle East, where Arabic scholars wrote commentaries on Aristotle. They preserved the Greek text, and those could later on be reintroduced back into the West. So this is another example of that sort of peaks and valleys view of history. Now I'm going to go on into some of the traditional branches of philosophy. We've already kind of talked about them a little bit. The order here doesn't really matter so much, but first of all, epistemology, the study of how knowledge is possible, or how we go about knowing things and making sure that our knowledge is accurate or useful. This might seem kind of obvious, but we sort of take it for granted that of course we can know things. But just think about if you were to observe a wreck on the highway. We'll take Highway 1 right here that goes between Aiken and Augusta. If, let's say, 20 or 30 people observe the wreck, we might have 20 or 30 different accounts of what happened. One person might say, well, it was a silver car and a blue SUV. Another person would say, well, no, actually it was a Mazda Miata that was red. And the other person would say, well, yeah, it was a blue truck, but it was not an SUV, right? So we could have 20 different stories of what happened. And of course, then the police investigator has to reconstruct what actually happened in the accident. So, you might say, well, of course, knowledge comes from the senses, right? That's empiricism. But saying that all knowledge arises from the senses, it doesn't really get us all that far, right? Because we still have this question of, well, whose senses are we talking about, and how can we use those senses properly? So that's a whole field of philosophy called epistemology. Another field is called ethics. This is one of the branches of what is called value theory or axiology. Ethics is the study of how we arrive at morally correct behavior. There's tons of competing ethical theories. There has for a long time in the West been an attempt to create a science of ethics. We would like for there to be a science of ethics. Of course, it doesn't really exist yet. Ethics is still very much in question. And it's probably one of the most important challenges facing humanity today, to find a better ethical theory. Next, aesthetics. The classical question in aesthetics was, what is beauty? What does it mean for something to be beautiful, right? Over time, this is another branch of value theory. Over time, aesthetics transitioned more recently into a theory of what is art? What does it mean for something to be art? Which is the more recent question. Next, metaphysics, the study of the underlying structures of reality. What does it mean for something to exist? What is being? And just for fun, because I'm a phenomenologist, we're going to add that in there. Phenomenology is the study of lived reality and the connections between mind and body. So what's the difference between a third-person description of reality and reality as I experience it? And we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we get into philosophy of mind. Then there's also a lot of philosophy ofs, and you'll see what I mean by that. Philosophy of science. What are the assumptions, the metaphors, the preconditions that make scientific knowledge possible? Scientists are very good at doing what they do, biologists doing biology, physicists doing physics, but scientists may not be as aware of the epistemological issues in what they do. They might not even be aware that they're employing metaphor, or if they are aware that they're employing metaphor, they might sort of take that metaphor as a throwaway notion and not really look into their employment of metaphor. This is a very fascinating field. Each one of these points on these slides could be the subject for an entire course, or indeed an entire career of study. So I'm just kind of hitting the high points here. Philosophy of religion examines things like what are the proofs for the existence of God, or the proofs for the non-existence of God? What is the relationship between rationality and faith? How could we have so many different religious traditions on the earth? They appear to conflict in various different ways. In other ways, they seem to agree. So why is that? Next, philosophy of mind. What is the relationship between the mind and the brain? What is the relationship between human knowing and other forms of knowing? Say when animals know something or when an artificial intelligence knows something. Are these comparable or are they overlapping? What exactly is the relationship there? And then there's also a lot of other philosophy of law, philosophy of mathematics, philosophy of South Park, and so forth, right? Okay, well, when philosophers do their work, they do so by naming names. And I got this from a pragmatist named Richard Rorty. He says, when philosophers do their work, they generally begin by saying what the philosophers before them have said, and they will position themselves in a lineage or a school of philosophy. So philosophers usually don't just, they might start out by just writing down their thoughts, but as they do their work, they're going to begin to articulate how they fit into the tradition. So there's lots of different schools or traditions. British empiricism, American pragmatism. You might not have known that there's a uniquely American school of thought. Figures such as C.S. Peirce, John Dewey, William James, and so forth. And then deconstruction, which is a French, basically philosophy of language. And then there's also feminist philosophy, which is a whole area of inquiry. So usually philosophers will sort of position themselves in one of these traditions or schools. And the same thing is happening in philosophy that's happened in literature and other disciplines. An attempt has been made to include more non-Western sources. And you will see that in this course as well. And I just have for you here, before we continue with ancient philosophy, a quotation from Heraclitus. This is from the lovely translation by Brooks Haxton, which I really recommend. So you can just sit back and relax. And I'm going to read this through. Maybe we'll read it a few times, actually. And I would like for you to just kind of sit with this and reflect on it and let it sort of follow you around over the next day or so. For wisdom, listen not to me, but to the word, and know that all is one. Those unmindful when they hear, for all they make of their intelligence, may be regarded as the walking dead. People dull their wits with gibberish, and cannot use their ears and eyes. Where it says the word, in Greek it's the logos, but I think it's actually very similar to the Eastern concept of the Tao. And I'll just read it again. For wisdom, listen not to me, but to the word, and know that all is one. Those unmindful when they hear, for all they make of their intelligence, may be regarded as the walking dead. People dull their wits with gibberish, and cannot use their ears and eyes. So that's the thought that I'll leave you with. And I'm going to go ahead and end this recording now, and we'll pick up next time with more ancient philosophy.